As I said, I think several days ago at the beginning of this conference, we've made it this far, and I said that would probably be a catchphrase for me, certainly for this conference. This is the second time I'm going to use it, so maybe it's not a catchphrase, but we've made it this far. Thank you so much, all of you, for being here and for celebrating with us the 40 years of the Human Rights Centre. This is our final session of our final event of those celebrations that have been occurring somewhat haphazardly due to a whole range of different circumstances and challenges throughout the year, but a whole range of programs to celebrate that particular year. I'll make some very final comments following this particular roundtable session. It is with real pleasure that I can introduce colleagues and colleagues going back some time as well. Actually, hundreds of years in the case of Michael. Jude Bueno de Mesquita is, as you all know, I'm sure needs no introduction. Jude is, in terms of the Human Rights Centre, is a co-deputy director in the Human Rights Centre for research and has been for some time now. We work well together, and we fight off the challenges that come from various quarters. To my left is Professor Michael Freeman. Michael is Emeritus Professor in the Government Department. One of my earliest roles within the Human Rights Centre was basically supporting Michael when Michael was the Scheme Director for the MA, 2002, a long time ago. And Michael has remained a close interlocutor, I think is probably the right phrase. I look to critical insights from Michael. And to my right is the most recent. Wake up. Okay. the most recent colleague and collaborator, should we say co-collaborator, co-conspirator, Catherine Gilmore, who is honorary professor in the Human Rights Centre, has been now for 2 years plus. Catherine, I'm sure many of you have already encountered Catherine. Kate,
yeah,
sorry.
No, Catherine sounds terrible.
I've encountered
Catherine
Kate.
sounds like my mother's talking, and that's.
Don't want to go there. Would you like to talk about that? Okay.
Later.
Kate.
No, same with Judith. For me. See, I'm telling you.
Kate.
Hi,
Kate. Kate, you would have encountered some of you on other occasions, and needs no further introduction or discussion about motherly relationships. Cool. Okay.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Jude.
Yeah.
15 minutes or so, is that?
Probably less, yeah.
Okay,
yeah,
fantastic.
Give me a tap if I'm going.
I will do.
Good afternoon. Well done in sticking to the end. So today I'm going to talk about human rights and new and future crises. And I think most of you know that my area of research is health and human rights, in particular, global health and human rights, and also economic, social and cultural rights. But before delving into my paper, my discussion, I wanted just to sort of pause to pay tribute to what I call the current generation of economic, social and cultural rights defenders from Essex University. So obviously Essex historically, most historically, has had a strong focus on civil and political rights, as well as on contexts of armed conflict and international humanitarian law. But over the years, economic, social and cultural rights sneaked in, okay? This was thanks, reflecting back before looking forwards, this was really thanks to Kevin Boyle, who in the 1990s, hot off the 1993 Vienna Declarations, thought that we should have a programme, and this is before my time, okay? But he thought, so not quite that old, he thought we should have a module on economic, social and cultural rights. And not only that, we should have a module on development and human rights, which was kind of even before the commitment in the UN to the sort of bringing together of development and human rights, after, of course, the UN Declaration on the Right to Development. So I arrived at Essex as an LLM student on a whim, really, in the year 2000. Also with Noam Lubel, who I should say was my best friend in my LLM year. So funny we should both be here on the staff. And these courses were a bit fringe in those times, and they weren't that great, to be honest, because there wasn't a rich scholarship, wasn't a very rich scholarship as there is now. And so, economic, social and cultural rights was very structured around just looking at general comments, and there were some textbook articles, but it's a really different story now. And a lot of this is to do with the field of economic, social and cultural rights activists and scholars. And I haven't talked to all of these people. Some of them predate me, but a lot of them have been here since, and they've made really key contributions to the field. And I can't tell you about all of them, but I'll just mention a few of them. Some of them are in the room, you'll know. Some of them you will recognise. Okay, this does work. So we have Sandra Liebenberg, class with Ian and Mervat in 92, was it, you said? 93, 92. And Ian referred to Sandy's important role yesterday in terms of working on the development of the South African Constitution, which is, of course, the sort of, gold standard for economic and social rights. Sandy also has been a member of the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and she more recently was the lead drafter on the Maastricht Principles on future generations, which I'm going to come back and talk to. We have Paul Hunt, who is currently the chair of he's the Chief Human Rights Commissioner in New Zealand. He's been also on the UN Committee and UN Special Rapporteur on the right to health. And one of the new current members of the committee, Ju-Yong Lee, she's a graduate of Essex. She did a PhD here, and she's a professor at the University of Seoul in South Korea. I can't really go through everybody, but in the bottom line, we have people working in national institutions, NGOs, and national human rights institutions, and UN agencies at the national level. We then have people in the next row up, working at international NGOs, and actually a lot of the international NGOs that work on human rights, their leads on economic, social and cultural rights are graduates of Essex. Magdalena was, she's the director of the Global Initiative on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, also having been the UN Special Rapporteur, Independent Expert on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. And then I was going to say that and I forgot. Yeah, she was your friend, in fact, not just your year.
We used to be silent when Nigel would say economic, social and cultural rights are not human rights.
Yeah, well, there you go. And look what happened. She went and got all these important jobs. And then we also have people who made, in the top right corner, Tara, Jackie, Sigmund Skogli, Koldo, Julie, important academic contributions to the field. And it's hard to single somebody out, but Sigmund Skogli has been really important, and some of you will have read her work. She sort of spearheaded work on human rights in the context of international financial institutions. That was her first project. And then she spearheaded work on extraterritorial obligations and economic, social and cultural rights. So yesterday we heard about the important Bankovic case, which Françoise and others took to the European Court of Human Rights, which was important, looking at extraterritorial obligations and civil and political rights. And Sigrun's work on ESC rights and development has been important. And she's also been involved in these Maastricht Principles on future generations. Okay, so leaving the faces of Essex, I'm going to focus now on my talk, which is on human rights and future threats. So I was just thinking, I went to start writing this talk. I went back to the UN Charter and to the preamble of the UN Charter, and the first paragraph of the preamble sets out the purposes of the UN to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, and promote social progress and better standards of life. And of course, the Charter was drafted with the horrors of the Holocaust and World War II and the recent 1930s depression in mind. And the UN's establishment was therefore guided by the vision of preempting and preventing another global conflict and a commitment to economic and social progress taken forward in those early years through welfare states, international development and economic globalization, all of which we can and do in our classes critique from the human rights point of view. But these visions were really influential in the development of the Code of Human Rights, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, and the early treaties. As we heard yesterday, Essex has been, I'm going to sort of keep on referring to Essex throughout this talk as well. Essex was also important in driving the development of civil and political rights and economic, social and cultural rights. So after we have the Twin Covenants, Nigel's work on torture and Paul Hunt's work on economic, social and cultural rights in the 1990s. Together with those two sort of civil and political, economic, social and cultural rights, obviously we had the very important articulation of the right to development in the 1960s, 1970s following decolonisation, which also has helped shape the human rights movement. The global threats which were apparent at the time of the establishment of the UN, or at least those threats that were most at the forefront of everyone's mind, while they remain highly pertinent today, the UN Charter has not given that much attention to rising global threats, which are now much more prominently on our agenda, including epidemics and pandemics, and the existential threat, as somebody called it yesterday, of climate change and the ecological crises. And these threats do not have a historically strong presence in human rights theory and practice. Nevertheless, parallel to human rights, the international community has developed important standards in these areas, of course not particularly effectively. So the international health regulations were a weak and very partial approach to the governance of global health crises. They've been criticised in the context of how they performed in the Ebola epidemic and in the COVID pandemic. And the climate change regime, which has been very slow to evolve and critically has not been terribly effective. So in both cases, these regimes have been quite weak, and it's also been limited attention to human rights. And that's left human rights very vulnerable to abuses in these contexts. That's not to say, of course, if there was much more human rights in there, that they would necessarily be protected, but there is some value in having these things robustly articulated, and when you don't have that in the first place, there's very little hope. And the human rights community also, until recently, gave quite limited attention to these crises. But this has significantly changed in the last 5 years, or a little over 5 years or so. As the human rights communities began to focus on how human rights are affected by the threat of infectious diseases and climate change and ecological crises. So in relation to the environment, as Marina mentioned earlier, we have the articulation of a right to a healthy environment, environmental rights, the rights of nature, and rights of non-human animals in the more than human category as well. And in the context of COVID-19, we've seen a lot of work that's been done more recently on the protection of human rights in public health, infectious disease responses, which has been responsive to what's been called a pandemic of human rights abuses in the COVID-19 response by the UN Secretary General. So how has the human rights community responded to this? Well, in many ways. But one thing I want to... Where do I point this to? There we go. Yeah, so one thing I want to talk about is new standard setting exercises in the field of human rights. And in the spring of this year, there's been two really important, I've been involved in both of them, so I might be a bit biased, but I think they're really important sets of standards adopted to clarify how to interpret human rights in the context of such threats. So on the left, we have the Human Rights and Public Health Emergencies Principles and Guidelines. And this has been overseen by the International Commission of Jurists, who have overseen other notable sets of human rights principles, like the Syracuse Principles, which this is a sort of follow-up to, as well as the Yogyakarta Principles. And on the right, we have the principles which Ian asked about earlier, the Maastricht Principles on human rights of future generations. And this was coordinated by Women's University. And this is the fourth set of really important principles that have come out of Maastricht. The first one was called the Limburg Principles, and then there's the Maastricht Principles on Violations of Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the Maastricht Principles on Extraterritorial Obligations, and now the Maastricht Principles on the Human Rights of Future Generations. And you'd not be surprised to know, perhaps, that Essex alumni have been very prominent in both of these initiatives. In terms of the Maastricht Principles, Sandy Liebenberg was the lead drafter, and Sigrun Skogli was on the steering group, and she was involved in the whole conceptualization of this document, and a number of other, and Magdalena Sepulveda also was on the drafting group, and then another load of people who have been at Essex have been involved in working groups and in supporting the drafting process. And in terms of the human rights and public health emergencies principles, these were overseen at the ICJ by Ian Siderman, who is a graduate from Essex from, I think, around 92, quite a long time ago anyway. And I've also been on the steering group of this initiative. So both in the context of climate change and pandemics and epidemics, it's vital to think about protecting human rights in the context of these threats. And that's both in terms of how to protect human rights after these threats have arrived, so the sort of adaptation strand of actions in relation to climate change, so how can adaptation protect against human rights violations, and also how can infectious diseases planning and responses do a better job of not infringing on human rights. But these new initiatives are also important because they turn their attention, quite meaningfully to questions of prevention as well. So they're looking in a much more upstream way than perhaps is traditional in human rights in human rights work. I mean, it's not unprecedented, and obviously there's been a lot of important work in terms of rights-based approaches and in terms of impact assessments and so on and so forth. They're not totally not without precedent, but I think that the degree of emphasis that they place on prevention and the sort of actions that can be taken upstream is really important and quite novel. So just to give you, hang on. Sorry, can I just? Let's put it back on. Yeah. So just to mention, just to draw out a couple of extracts. So the Maastricht Principles, they have a whole principle on prevention and precaution, drawing on the concept of the precautionary principle, which you find in international environmental law. They say that states, where there are reasonable grounds for concern that the impacts of states or non-state conduct, whether singly or in aggregate, may result in violations of human rights of future generations, states have an obligation to prevent the harm and must take all reasonable steps to avoid or minimise such harm. So that's quite I think that's quite a sort of far-reaching conceptualisation of human rights obligations. Has important implications. And this is not totally divorced from what's been going on in the sort of official interpretations by UN treaty bodies, and this is sort of meant to consolidate and be progressive interpretation of those standards. So it's not totally sort of far-fetched. And then on the right, with the human rights and public health emergencies principles, again, they have a whole section on public health emergency prevention and preparedness. I would have liked to have seen in that section that it went a bit further in terms of the prevention activities. So it's really looking at prevention and preparedness, particularly in terms of how we can manage health sectors and better in advance of the arrival of epidemics or pandemics, so that they don't struggle to cope in the way that they did with COVID. And that's really important. But there was a discussion about whether it should go further, and we need to look at issues to do with the intersections and interfaces between nature and the environment and humans, and look at the sorts of actions that can be taken even further upstream to prevent the emergence of very threatening infectious diseases. I think in reality, they felt that there wasn't sufficient legal basis at the present to include that in the principles, but it'd be interesting to see how it evolves in the future. So I think these initiatives are kind of emblematic of a turn in scholarship and practice on human rights, particularly economic, social and cultural rights, towards increasingly challenging social, economic and political structures that underlie human rights of vulnerability and abuses. Early Marxist critical scholars like Paul O'Connell, Susan Marks, they sort of put down a challenge to people to look more at not just the sort of immediate causes and sort of sticking plaster solutions, but look at those root causes, the social, the environmental root causes. And ultimately that takes you to critique of capitalism, basically, particularly in the economic, social, and environmental rights field. And then obviously we have critiques from people like Samuel Moyn and Global South, Twale scholars like Usha Natharajan as well, which, where there's also this sort of narrative around capitalism and human rights and what's the relationship between them and what's the human rights community doing about them. And I think particularly the Maastricht principles are sort of quite emblematic of the human rights community starting to address some of these issues a bit more robustly. So one of the preambular paragraphs of the principles says that the cessation of unsustainable patterns of production, consumption and lifestyles is required to guarantee the full enjoyment of human rights. For future generations, human development must be decoupled from the destruction of nature and overconsumption of natural resources to achieve the realisation of human rights of present and future generations, and the integrity of nature and natural systems. It doesn't name capitalism, but it doesn't take a lot of imagination for us to see what it's trying to get at. I think really drawing on Andrew's point about fruitless critiques, one of the things that I've also been involved in recently with colleagues from SOAS and University of Cape Town and National Law University of Delhi is that we're trying to move. I'm not a critical scholar by my my research has not sort of been embedded in that critical scholarship tradition, but I enjoy to read the critical scholarship, and I agree with Andrew that sometimes I find there's a bit of these fruitless approaches, right? So what we've been trying to do is trying to build on that critical scholarship to imagine different futures and where human rights sit within them. So we have a project which is looking at post-growth economy and law. So in this project, we're hoping to do a book about it, and we've recently had a workshop. The idea is to engage with scholarship from other disciplines around concepts like degrowth, buen vivir, ecological swaraj, donut economics, and try and understand if we're having transitions to different societies because of the climate crisis and because of the problems which capitalism causes for the climate and for human rights, then how does human rights fit in these different social futures, environmental futures? So to conclude, so I think that human rights practice and scholarship is rising to the challenge of addressing future significant threats to human rights. There's been a rise in critical approaches, which has been very helpful. There's been a rise in interdisciplinary research between law, with law and public health, and ecological economics, political economy, and so on and so forth. I think in the university, in our programs, we're also responding to these challenges. So just to give a couple of examples, in the last few years, the modules that Tara and I run both incorporated environment explicitly into them. So a module on development and environment and rights, and a module on trade, investment, environment and human rights. We also, what was I going to say? We also have a reading group here on human rights and capitalism, which has provided an interesting, that's for academics and PhD students, an interesting opportunity to discuss some of these issues. But I think the question, as always, in the case for human rights, is how to translate all of this into action. And it feels overwhelming, and in the face of sort of power inequalities, and also in the face of the increasing challenges that we find to human rights. And one of the things that troubles me is that in the COVID-19 pandemic, we had this constant refrain that we had from the UN, from Dr. Tedros, from Antonio Guterres, that none of us are safe until we are all safe. And this was to a degree true. However, the troubling lesson of the pandemic was that contrary to this call to actions, people in some parts of the world and some parts of society were safer and became safe much more quickly and easily and at the expense of others. It's also clear that security rather than human rights was often the dominant approach to the threats that we face. Was it in the 1990s when Kofi Annan said that we are moving from a stage of norm setting to implementation? And I feel that the implementation stage of some of the issues that I work on, the work is only just beginning. Thank you.
Apologies, no pictures. I was one of the first people in this university to use PowerPoint, and it was not a happy experience. So I now suffer from PTSD, that's post-technology stress disorder. Okay, so presentation begins here. I must begin with a disclaimer. I am not an expert on the future. In my discipline, political theory, predicting the future is notoriously risky. Almost no one predicted the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. The New York Times confidently predicted that Hillary Clinton would defeat Donald Trump in the 2016 US presidential election. Most political scientists predicted that the UK would vote to remain in the European Union in the 2016 referendum, and so on. Human rights predictions can be roughly divided into the pessimistic and the optimistic. Here are a couple of recent titles from the pessimists. Human Rights on the Road to Nowhere, and Welcome to the Post-Human Rights World. Here are the pessimists' main arguments. Democracy is in decline around the world, according to several influential monitoring agencies. Authoritarian governments are becoming more authoritarian, e.g., China, Russia, North Korea, Afghanistan, Iran, Syria, Egypt. China is providing an influential model of authoritarian economic development. Established democracies are becoming more authoritarian, e.g., India, Brazil, Venezuela, the Philippines, Israel, Turkey, Poland, Hungary, Italy, USA, and the United Kingdom. Authoritarian populist nationalism is challenging liberal internationalism in many countries. There's been a backlash against recent advances in women's and LGBT+ rights. The number of refugees and asylum seekers has increased, and their condition has worsened. The decline of the West will be followed by the decline of human rights. Human rights are implicated in neoliberalism that limits their potential. Human rights advocates underestimate the costs of human rights when they threaten other values, such as peace, security, and economic development. Lack of evidence may mean that the state of human rights is actually worse than is generally recognized. Recent optimistic titles include Evidence for Hope and Yes, human rights practices are improving. Here are some of the optimists' arguments. There have been numerous pro-human rights court decisions around the world in recent years. There have been improvements in women's, LGBT+, children's, disability, minority, and indigenous rights. There have been improvements in economic and social rights, e.g. maternal and infant mortality, health and life expectancy, literacy and education. There's been increased human rights grassroots activism around the world. Resistance continues even in the most authoritarian countries, e.g. China, Russia, Myanmar, Saudi Arabia, Iran and Afghanistan. The association of human rights with neoliberalism is thrice false. It is historically false. Human rights were launched in the 1940s when neoliberalism was not influential. It is theoretically false. The political ideology of human rights is social democratic, not neoliberal. It is false in practice. Human rights activists frequently contest neoliberal policies. The challenge of cultural relativism has been overcome in part by the concept of vernacularization, which reconciles international human rights norms with local discourses. Global challenges, for example, climate change, nuclear weapons, terrorism, migration, pandemics, demand international responses. There is evidence that the global poor and oppressed are looking to human rights to solve their problems. Pessimists compare the current state of human rights with an ideal. Comparison with the past shows progress. Here are some thoughts about how we might go beyond the pessimism versus optimism debates. Both pessimists and optimists lack sufficient empirical evidence. There is evidence for path dependency. Countries with bad human rights histories tend to have bad human rights records now. Those with good histories have good records now. Some countries switch from bad to good, but not many. The path dependency thesis is, however, controversial. Human rights in practice are so complex and so diverse that most generalizations about them are suspect. We should move beyond the pessimism versus optimism debate to study the conditions favorable and unfavorable to human rights improvement and decline. The pessimism versus optimism debate is shaped by a false distinction between structure and agency. Pessimists tend to emphasize structural inequalities, whereas optimists rely on human agency. However, structures always constrain agency, while agency can transform structures. Human rights theory and practice are too attached to the model of perpetrator, violation, victim. Future threats may not fit this model, e.g. climate change, pandemics, artificial intelligence. The human rights movement is too attached to the Enlightenment idea of progress that has been shattered by the Holocaust, Stalinism, and other human rights disasters of the past century. There are two other reasons why the idea of progress is problematic. One, the world is too complex to be adequately represented by such a simple idea. And two, the idea of incommensurability implies that we have no means to balance human rights achievements with human rights failures. The Human Rights Measurement Initiative tells us, for example, that China is worst in the world for the right to freedom from arbitrary arrest, but among the best for the rights to food, health, and housing. There is no consensus on how to balance these findings to reach an overall judgment. However, we can identify local progress, as in particular advances in women's rights. Recent contributions to the history of human rights have accused so-called textbook histories of telling a linear, teleological, progressivist, and triumphalist story of human rights. The new history of human rights emphasizes human rights as products of political struggles whose outcomes are highly contingent. Pessimists infer from this the fragility of human rights achievements, but it is also possible to infer the fragility of authoritarian systems and to emphasize the global nature of human rights struggles, thereby countering the charge of West-centrism that has been made against the traditional histories. The social science of human rights has made considerable advances in recent years, but there's still much disagreement about methodology, conclusions, and practical implications. This literature overemphasizes civil and political rights compared with economic and social rights. The prospects for human rights may be eliminated by threat theory. Internal or external threats to state elites in both authoritarian and democratic systems tend to produce violent and authoritarian responses by the state. Similarly, internal and external threats to society tend to produce xenophobic responses by society. The principal current threats are climate change, pandemics, nuclear war, terrorism, and out-of-control technology. The idea of human rights has empirical and normative weaknesses. There is much that we do not know about the social conditions of human rights and of their social costs. A theory of human rights should specify the obligations that they impose on others and show that these obligations are not unreasonably burdensome. There is much that we do not know and an absence of consensus about how human rights relate to other human values. Optimism and pessimism are partly evidence-based, but also reflections of personality rather than conclusions of science. There is no science of the future, and prediction is less secure in political science than it is in astronomy. No one seems to have noticed how odd the pessimist metaphors have been. Stephen Hopgood writes of the end times of human rights without noticing that the end times in Christian eschatology refer to the time when good will triumph over evil. Eric Posner writes of the twilight of human rights law without noticing that twilight is followed by dawn. The human rights movement is not on the road to nowhere, but it must navigate a course between naive optimism and cynical pessimism. It has to reach beyond human rights law to history and social science. It must reconcile the ideal with the feasible. Jeremy Bentham, that arch-enemy of human rights, held that both the appeal and the danger of human rights discourse lay in its simple dogmatism and its refusal to engage in the hard intellectual work of thinking through the consequences of implementing general principles in the complex circumstances of society. The future of human rights lies in doing the hard intellectual work of proving Bentham to have been wrong. Max Weber called on us to exercise, quote, the trained relentlessness in viewing the realities of life, end quote. But he also said, quote, that all historical experience confirms the truth that man, we would say humans, would not have attained the possible unless time and again he, we would say they, had reached out for the impossible. The future is unpredictable, but it is likely to be hard and it is likely to be messy. I end with a toast popular among Soviet dissidents. Here's to the success of our hopeless cause. Their cause, of course, was not hopeless, but its outcome has been messy. Thank you.
Well, it's a curse to go last, and it's a shame we still have time.
5 minutes.
Okay. In a way, it's also rather wonderful because we didn't coordinate our interventions, and yet I hope you will see some symmetry, but maybe some, crunchy points in there as well. And I wanted to start in the world where human rights matter most. And, long before the COVID-19 pandemic or Russia's invasion of Ukraine and our warmongering responses to it, long before the women and girls of Afghanistan were abandoned or multiple deaths tolerated weekly on the high seas of forced migration. Long before, there were human rights challenges aplenty, concocted in conflict, contagion, corruption, climate collapse. 60% of the world's wildlife has been lost in the last 50 years alone. The so-called recovery from the 2007 stock market and banking crises have deepened inequalities and spread them wider within and between countries, north and south, east and west, driving further evidence of how utterly unsustainable is the rich world's greed and consumption, reinforcing utterly the paucity of opportunity for the world's largest ever generation of young people, 90% of whom live outside the nihilistic global north, meaning also more people on the move than ever before in human history since World War II, meaning also more of us living for the first time in human history in urban rather than rural settings, hundreds of millions in substandard peri-urban conditions, mired in poverty, pollution, and environmental degradation. Meantime, arguably the most disruptive and certainly the least well-governed fourth industrial revolution has us both more connected and yet more dismembered. Digital technologies tracking our every preference, purchase and peccadillo, rendering obsolete, cherished analogue notions of privacy and security, transforming both threat and attack with such as slaughter bots, unmanned autonomous weaponry, as well as technologies redefining human life itself. And contemporaneous to that, a dismantling of the international communities we've known it on which modern human rights so relies, a dissembling under weight of member states' hypocrisies, their conflicts of interest, their poor performance, their ill preparedness, the absence of leadership, leaving spaces to be filled now by a newly sanitized, hyper-wealthy China and its alternative international systems that it's building in development terms, in jurisprudential terms, in human rights terms, in international cooperation terms. A newly sanitized China, hardly balanced any longer by that hyper-wealthy but newly desanitized misanthropic US and its domestic politics. A circumstance, my friends, that leaves state sovereignty as the single largest impediment to the realization of human rights. State sovereignty in escalation as civic space is under attack at the hands of governments the world over, leaving more than 4 billion people not merely under threat of law, but beyond its protection. That empirically, factually, is our present, a one-time, unimaginable future. Something even the UN Secretary General has had to call a perfect storm of crises. And it's the very stuff of which future futures too will be born. In other words, as the science fiction writer William Gibson famously suggested, the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. Incidentally, he less famously, but wisely nonetheless, also said, if someone claiming to be from the future had shown me Boris Johnson, I would have told him to F off. What Gibson reminds us is the more material of the future challenges for the Human Rights Project are certainly, as Michael's already said so powerfully, less in pondering artificial binaries of hope and hopelessness about the future, but it lies with the questions of who is the future for? Who has a future and who does not? The end times are already here for LGBTQI people in Uganda, for trans people in Brazil, murdered at the highest rates in the world, for the Palestinians under occupation, for the Democrats of Sudan, for the Rohingya of Myanmar, for the Uyghur of China, for the Aboriginal women of Canada, the US and Australia, for the girls of Ciudad Juarez, for the people of Tuvalu, whose very nation is disappearing under the rising tides of global warming. Their future is already here. And it is the end times. But just as arguably, utopia too has arrived. You'll be pleased to know, or at least their version of it, for the world's richest 1% at least, whom Oxfam tells us has bagged during COVID nearly twice as much wealth as the rest of the world put together in just 2 years. The future, in other words, is already in motion. From a human rights standpoint, the project's challenge then is to load the dice, to act in ways that shift probabilities of future possibilities, to shift them in the direction of human dignity for all and away from the dramatically catastrophic paths that are unfolding in front of our very eyes. Now, from reading the stars to reading the tea leaves, down through the ages, humans have sought to predict, organise and control the future, again, as Michael has said. But they've done so with this one common assumption, that somehow life will unfold steadily and in familiar ways. We're the first generation for whom that assumption simply doesn't hold. First, the pace and the scale of change has changed, and across multiple dimensions. We face something that can be described as J-shaped change. Change that is replacing the familiar linear shape of the bottom of the J to now be exponential, explosive, and extremely difficult to extrapolate. When the expert scientific panel advising the high-level forum on progress under the Sustainable Development Goals presented their advice, they showed a PowerPoint slide of 12 graphs. Those graphs were grouped in categories, into 4 categories: movement of capital, movement of people, movement of information, movement of goods, since 1970. Each and every one of the 12 graphs reported J-shaped change. Now, contemporaneous with that J-curve change, but predating it too, is my second point. The second way in which change is different, and it concerns the ruptures underway in the very nature of being human, and thus in the very fabric of the human community. Some of those ruptures are long-standing and waiting still for redress. The ruptures of bigotry, of prejudice, of misanthropy, joining now new ruptures induced by technologies, manifest not only in artificial intelligence challenge to human hegemony, but in humanity's efforts to bridge the human-machine divide, such that human life and intelligence is now today to be engineered by human life and intelligence, and not by evolution. That transhumanism is a sub-universalist vision of change. The cyborg is no equalizer. The long-standing ruptures in humanness that we have manufactured through racism, xenophobia, homophobia, aporophobia await still their resolution. but meantime are to be found intact, reproduced and buried deep in the algorithms that are rendering newly clever, so-called intelligent means of perpetuating old ignorances. And the third novelty, unique to our era, unlike that deliberated upon by our predecessors, is that among the many possible futures that our present reality gives glimpse to, there stands out for the very first time with imminence the scenario of human-induced human extinction. We're not the first generation to imagine our own end, but we're the first generation who can achieve it. We're the first generation who could choose to be the last in the blink of an eye, or actually the push of a button. But also, we're the first generation that through our self-pleasuring choices, with their self-harming consequences, that steadily, grindingly, certainly can take ourselves to the same place, extinction. And they're the three dimensions. It's the arc: acceleration, rupture, catastrophe. The arc of change, the stuff from which our possible futures are being made. Thank you. No. You're all looking so depressed. I thought I'd just... No, it's all right. I've got something else to say. Maybe it'll lift it up. My point is, actually, is that is the arc of reality from which we cannot afford to turn our backs. So my first invocation to us all is neither to hope nor despair, but to courage. To have the chutzpah, to stare into the abyss of it. Not sugarcoat it. I drink my way out. No, don't drink. Don't do that. You know, alcohol, don't do that. Not to sugarcoat it, but to stare into the abyss of it, to name it for what it is, and to have the courage to dare to imagine a deviation from the destiny that it seems to impose. But because the future, it's not predestined, it's not preordained. It's loaded for sure, but it's not locked. Not locked, just loaded. The future, after all, will be some unknown consequences of calibrations across those multiple dimensions. There's infinite permutations and combinations possible. But the human rights challenge is to tip that arc in favour of futures where common human dignity is sustained, uplifted, but without cost to other species and their habitats and to each other. So here are three human rights tipping points. Opportunities. Number one, our idea of time. Let's reframe the temporality dimensions of the Human Rights Project. Human rights' present-day preoccupations shapes, and I think is shaped partly by our tactics of analysis and action. Law, evidence gathering, documentation, demands for accountability, for example, all seem to work better in the here and now when addressing recent past injury and looking to near future prevention. But it's also setting us up for a massive failure, specifically to the rights of generations to come. Couldn't we move the Human Rights Project into what some have called the long now? Something that the peace activist Elsie Goulding called a 200-year present. Reframing the Human Rights Project within an envelope of time, encompassing our grandparents' parents and extending to our children's grandchildren. A project that would situate us, therefore, in the midstream, in the middle of a 200-year present, neither on the brink of an inevitable or unknown future yet to come, but nor passive recipients of the past that has been. In such a frame, the colonial legacies and the consequences of enslavement would be thought of as present time, not merely as historical acts, any more than responsibility for safe environment can be left as a problem for those to be born in 100 years' time. Human rights long-termism, in marked contrast to government's awful short-termism, would ask what must be done to correct the earlier legacies of the long now that are closing off sustainable futures today. We are the future created by enslavement. It was enslavement and colonisation that brought us into the world as we know it, not uniquely, but significantly. And important to acknowledge because they're unaddressed. They're barely named. They're not assayed. The redress and the reparation is not in any way a central demand of the Human Rights Project as we have imagined it in modern times. So, with a different temporal frame, what must be done to correct the earlier legacies of the long now that are closing off sustainable futures today? And in turn, what must we do to act in the present in such a way as that we don't sell out the futures for our descendants to come? Reframe, recenter time. Secondly, I think we have to recenter inequality, and to do that, we have to recenter indivisibility. Arguably, the critique that economic, social and cultural rights have been neglected in favour of civil and political rights, it's a false generalisation of the northern discourse as if it was all human rights discourse. But nonetheless, it would be useful, I think, to frame that more as an outcome of our failure to face up robustly to the root causes of today's inequality, as Jude said, the future gifted to us by such as enslavement and colonialist actions. But it's a failure that has put limits on human rights' transformative power. And it will destroy, unless addressed, the viability too of human rights for future generations. Human rights' own short-termism has eased the way for the demands for freedoms, such as civil and political rights, to trump those demands for equality. And the corrective lies, I think, not only with far greater intergenerational attentiveness, but with far greater emphasis on the indivisibility and interdependence of rights. To stop this false, paralysing binary that poses ESC, economic, social and cultural rights, as if an alternative to work on civil and political rights. And for that to happen, we have to put far more emphasis on indivisibility, displacing what I would say is the dominance of the arguments of universality. Because if universality is about our common humanity, indivisibility is about human rights' common relevance. And calibrating interventions accordingly. We cannot and will not be free from fear or want until we first are more equal. The third tipping point, away from that misanthropic arc of the future, might be called, as some have said, the democratisation of the future. It's basically pluralism in standpoints, diversity in voices, broadening of contribution to the shaping of the dynamics that will make one form of future or another. And it's about dialogue, and it's about human agency as our greatest renewable resource. It's how we tip the arc of the future towards inclusion for common dignity and away from the segregations, the apartheids that shackle so many millions the world over. That's what can transform what lies ahead of us. Loading the dice in favour of a future more loyal to human rights is inherently a participatory, not an expert, a participatory project. And it demands a refining, if not redefining, of solidarity particularly in favour of much stronger horizontal linkages between and across rights struggles. Time, inequality and indivisibility, and participation, tipping points for the arc of our future, for more pluralistic human rights favourable futures. Might I just say the human rights paradigm is no more ill-equipped to deal with the simultaneity, speed and spread of existential challenges that we face than law is itself. But while human rights values are perennials, our theories of change and our tactics, our tools have to be overhauled. But what so many don't factor into that critique or that call for change is this: the enduring, unique function, the core purpose of the human rights project, for which there is no known alternative. And it's the function of human rights that matters most. And it is its purpose to stand with the relatively powerless, where and whenever they confront the relatively powerful, and to stand there for protection from abuse that power inequity enables, and for the agency and the action that realisation of dignity requires. Ultimately, if you don't know where you're going, you've no idea how you'll get there, at least know who you are. Know what you stand for.
So I was completely engrossed. I should have been a slightly better timekeeper, but fantastic panel, really amazing panel to finish off our two-day event. We have, let's say, 10 minutes, absolutely maximum 10 minutes for a Q&A. We would probably need several hours to really do justice to all of the complicated positions, perspective, arguments, provocations that were set out by our three speakers. But let's take 10 minutes for a Q&A, and then I just need a minute to say thank you to a whole range of people who have made this basically happen. So, questions, people. Don't be shy. None of us here are particularly scary. Well. Questions, provocations, downright objections. Abbas and Hamza.
I really enjoyed the presentation of Professor, can you hear me? Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Freeman. And I wonder if, from what I understood, was that like kind of human rights should be more of a process and more of an inclination rather than really something very kind of concrete and black and white in that sense. Is that a good impression? If it is not the right impression, how would you kind of in practice suggest that the ideas that you are developing and presenting are actually applicable in practice? So that is the question. And then from Judith. Thank you. I would like to know more about human rights and capitalism, and especially capitalism where? I know that Xi Jinping in China is calling his kind of system of government socialism, but is that also socialism? And how do you actually reconcile the difficulty of capitalism in countries that they don't call themselves capitalism? Thank you.
Shall we take the question from Hamza, who's Lyle? Hamza's over here. Yep. Thank you.
Thank you for all the presentations. Sometimes with my colleagues, we make this joke as human rights people. We are great party people. Like we always talk and stuff, and all of a sudden, all the pessimist atmosphere is everywhere. But at least we are all together, so no problem. Thank you for the presentation. I would like to ask my question about more historical perspective. Like many in the area argue that many movements, social movements, goes with cycles. If we implement this for human rights, maybe the rise of the human rights in the 90s, so it came to a peak point, and some political scientists argue that in the 2015 and onwards, there's a big decline on the liberties and these authoritarian regimes are going down or something. But I'm still not sure because we even don't agree if things are going well or not. So we cannot say which direction, up or down. But if we agree that it's going down, do you think that it's just a cycle of movements and we are just now experiencing a downward spiral, and at some point can it go up, like from the historical perspective? Thank you.
Hamza, was that a question to a specific panelist or generally to everyone?
No, general.
Okay, thank you. Any final? This would be the final question of the 40th anniversary.
No pressure.
Okay, it's these cameras. They turn people off. Who wants to? Michael, did you want to have a go at the first? Certainly the historical question. It's an area of particular interest that you've been exploring for some time now.
Not certain I got the question, but I apologize if I didn't. Just 2 quick points. First of all, there's been quite a lot of political science literature trying to measure whether human rights are getting better or worse. I'm afraid to say it's fairly inconclusive. There's some who say it's getting, most of them say it's either stagnating or getting worse. But there are some very technical statistical arguments, and some people say it's actually getting better. So I would say political science in that sense is a bit disappointing if you look to political science to answer the general question. The other quick point I'd make is that I've been reading quite a bit of the relatively new anthropology of human rights recently, particularly the work which I recommend strongly, one of my favorite human rights writers, Sally Engel-Merry, who sadly died fairly recently. And a friend and colleague of mine, Richard Wilson, who's a human rights anthropologist, has written a wonderful tribute to her, which contains a lot of very substantive points about what happens to human rights at what you might say grassroots level, where it intermixes with local cultures and how people are clearly making what we would call human rights claims, but they're making it within their own cultural traditions. And that gets extremely interesting and extremely complicated. And that makes it actually that throws a critical light on the political science, which is very insensitive to some of the things that are going on at the grassroots level. So we have the political science level, which measures global human rights, and we have the anthropological level, which looks at what's going on in a village here or among peasants there, and just comes up with an enormously complicated and rich picture. So it's quite difficult to make generalizations.
Thank you. Jude, did you want to respond to Abbas's question?
Andrew's written a book about capitalism and human rights, so maybe he's the expert. But it's a really good question. I suppose I would say, where to begin? If you look at human rights-related critiques of capitalism, they include, research that looks at how the capitalist economy has been successful on the basis of labour exploitation, on the basis of colonialism and slavery, and on the basis of the exploitation of natural resources, all of which have clearly significant human rights implications. And in addition to that, particularly when it comes to climate change, which is one of the things I'm talking about in my talk, capitalism has a relationship with economic growth, or it's premised largely upon economic growth at a certain level, and that is then contingent on this continuous plunder of resources and exploitation of people. So that's why I mentioned it, but that's also not to say that these are problems which are unique to capitalist systems, and they are also problems which you can see in other political, economic systems, whether or not they are, however they identify and whatever forms that they take. But yeah, thank you.
Okay, did you want to?
Just to say three things, maybe, for me, it's not, human rights is about means and ends. There's no question of that. And I think the thing we have to stay very loyal to is that human rights is not about, therefore, a particular political system or an economic method or approach. It is always about people. And you have to stick close to what people are experiencing in their day-to-day lives and who's winning and who's losing. Arguably, the reason why we now can see more clearly from a human rights standpoint and start talking about the utter antithesis of human rights as being capitalism is in fact not so much about capitalism per se, but about the sheer greed that it's enabled. The Human Rights Project has been powerful in talking about absences of power, but absolutely inadequate in problematizing sheer greed. And it's bloody-minded avarice that will take us to the brink. And this is why it's very clear to me, people, there's no doubt, we're in deep doo-doo. I don't care what technical term you use, I don't care whether you're a pessimist or an optimist, we're in such trouble that we may have like 3 decades left before we approach that which is a singularity so transforming our planet and the nature of human existence that we will be at a point of no return. Surely you've read the news just this week. 3 things. The hottest day on human record, followed by a hotter day. Putin talking again about the nuclear option available to him. And thirdly, once again, leaders of the artificial intelligence saying to governments, oh, please stop us. Please help us stop from building in human extinction into AI algorithms. There is no question these are rotten times, and until we wake up, smell that particular coffee, we will not scale up our response commensurately. If you want to feel comfortable and cozy, then don't do human frickin' rights. Go around at the corner and go and do economics. If you don't want to face up to the realities, go and work for UNICEF. I say that because I work for OHCHR. My point is, if you're uncomfortable, if you're not ready to be courageous, don't do human rights. We don't need you. If you need hope, go and do art. If you want justice, you do human rights and you do it with guts.
Thank you, everyone. What an amazing panel. Can we show our appreciation, please, to the panelists?